craft brewery angle got a lot of airplay in certain circles, and so 2 years ago we ran a workshop with Omafra at the Two Rivers Food Hub, and it was one of their most popular workshops that they've ever put on. And so we've been continuing the conversation. There's a couple of things involved in that conversation. So the largest purchaser in the craft brewing market in Canada, pretty much, since it's the largest craft brewery in Canada now that Mill Street's been sold, is Bose in Bankley Hill, and Bose is an organic brewery. So that limits the potential markets for many producers of small grains. But certainly they're interested in encouraging more production of ingredients that goes into their brewery. And now we have just a huge number of craft brewers in the Ottawa area. In fact, all throughout Eastern Ontario, we have craft distillers as well. But there are also specialty crops that people are showing an increasing interest in growing and marketing. So we thought we'd kick off a conversation on some of the potential of that. Omafra in this region is interested in working with us on doing a series of workshops depending on what people are interested in when it comes to developing specialty markets for certain crops. So there's a fair bit of interest in the region, and we thought we'd start tonight. Given that Ken was already in the province, we don't often get an opportunity like this. So I first came across Ken Meter's work back when I was starting my graduate work, and I was looking at regional economic development, and I was very interested in something called the local multiplier effect. And I have to say that Ken was one of the folks at the time who was using it, and I came across his work and was really interested in all the things he was doing, including a study that he did up in Manitoba, which, given that he's covered pretty much most of the states, and then there's Manitoba, he's also done a study in. I was interested in that, and then my work switched to working on food hubs, and lo and behold, I show up in Vermont one year, and there's Ken doing a big presentation on some of the work that they'd done in the Carolinas on distributed food hubs, and you know, since then I pretty much just go to his website, Crossroads, to see where I'm going to be in 3 years, because I pretty much know that's how it's going to work. So I asked Ken here this evening to talk to us about the potential for grains and specialty crop production in Eastern Ontario, just to open a conversation and talk to us about some of the things that he'd seen elsewhere, because Ken's seen pretty much everything. So, ladies and gentlemen, Ken Meter.
Well, and given the size of the group, I'd like to keep this fairly informal. And first of all, I mean, you actually challenged me to learn about something that I didn't know much about. So this is where I might be in 3 years. But I don't want to come across as an expert on grain in any way, but I do have a colleague in Michigan who I work closely with named Megan, and she runs a malting business, and I'm learning a lot from her. And I've done some research, and some of my interviews have gotten me to learn about grain collaborations across the U.S. But I'm mostly a food systems expert and really try to help community groups fashion a food system that will be appropriate to their needs and help them have more choice and more opportunities to really define their own food approaches. I think it would be best for me if we could just go around and people could tell me who's here, so I just know, I guess first of all your name, but also what brought you to this workshop, so I can think about how to tailor my comments. And if the process of showing slides seems impressive, we can just break down and do a smaller discussion too. So would you mind starting?
Sure. My name is Jason Gray. I actually work for the Ottawa Food Bank.
Oh, good.
I grow vegetables for the Ottawa Food Bank, but my interest in coming out was piqued by Phil, thankfully, because I just learned of you and your work just recently. I'm an agrologist as well, so obviously I have an interest in a broad range of things in agriculture, so that's how I...
Oh, great. I'd like to talk to you about growing food for the food bank sometime too. So.
Sure.
Great. Okay. Sir.
George Wright. I grew up half a mile this way.
All right.
So I didn't have to come far, but I grow grain, and we've been retailing it for about 15 years.
Okay.
So we mill it, and our specialty is rolled oats.
Especially is
Is rolled oats.
rolled oats.
Making rolled oats.
And you mill it and market it directly yourselves?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, so you know more about this than I do, but what brought you here?
I just have an obsession for learning, and there's so little of it in Ontario. It's just wonderful that
Okay.
Just Food brought in.
Okay, good. All right.
It's rare.
Well, thanks for coming.
Larry Vigorous. I'm from Finch. I found out about this through an email from our local NFU. And it was a topic that I was just interested in learning more about.
Great. Okay, thanks for coming.
I'm Sarah Parkinson. I live in Ottawa, and my background, my academic background is in agricultural extension, but I haven't done very much with it in the last few years. But I was just down in Ecuador, and so when I'm traveling, I just see where there's robust food systems that still seem functional, like they're going to be encroached obviously by what's going on in the world. So I'm just interested in the topic, and especially how to save what's already there.
Okay, good. Thanks for being here. Yeah.
I'm Karen Mella, and I will let Doug here explain where we came.
Okay.
We're together.
I'm interested in expanding or changing the cropping model to include more ancient grains, amaranth, spelt, buckwheats. I'm interested in how that could be marketed and approached in a more commercial fashion as opposed to just kind of hobby stuff.
Fantastic. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you for being here. Do you want to say a few words too?
I'm Irina Knazovich. I'm at Carleton University and have for several years now been studying food systems with Phil Mount.
Okay. And
I'm Denise. I'm Phil Mount's wife. I'm also a farmer. For the first time last year, I grew kamut on a very, very small scale. But grains do interest me because what I like to do is be able to grow everything we eat. And you have, that's interesting. I'd like to know more about milling.
all right. Good. People know you already. So.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think I will do a few slides. Again, we can break this down. And I mean, if it seems better just to talk with each other, I don't mind doing that. But let me start out with a few stories. And I'm going to first of all show you just some examples of, a little bit about where I've worked and some examples of people I've run into, which are not really grain related, but they do focus on the topic of how do we cluster business activity so it has more longevity and more stability for a local region, which is really, I think, the main message today for me is that I see some really rich collaborations where what happens is 3 or 4 businesses decide to share resources, share information, talk to each other frequently to say, how do we grow together? How do we do complementary work instead of saying, I'm competing with you because you're a business person and every dollar you earn is something I don't earn. It's a real different kind of attitude. And really economic developers often talk about doing business clusters to take advantage of local specialties, competitive advantages people have. But I think in this community food movement that we're part of, there's just amazing barriers falling down and people coming up with very innovative solutions by doing that. Have people here run across Shepherd's Grain out in the Pacific Northwest? So I'll have a few, I've interviewed them a few years ago and I have some slides about the stories they told me about how they formed a collaboration, which is really quite big now. And have a little bit of information from 3 farms in New York State and Illinois and Wisconsin who spoke at the Upper Midwest Organics Conference about a month ago. And I took a course from them and learned about how they structured their activities. So we have some specific examples of 3 farms that are all doing similar work, but very much shaped by their climate, the neighbors they have, the business opportunities that came forward. So I'll talk about that for a while, and we can do more than that, or we can kind of stay with that and discuss for a while. If I say something confusing, just interrupt me because this is too small a group to lose somebody. Phil mentioned I've done a lot of work across the states, and now I've actually, just gave a speech in Hastings County last night down in Belleville in Madoc for Harvest Hastings. So I've now got 2 provinces, and I've worked with 3 tribal groups. But I show this slide mostly because there really are discussions like this happening, not all about grain, some about produce, some about food banking, some about food processing and food hubs. But this discussion is happening all over the continent right now, and it's really exciting for me to be a part of that in whatever way I can be. Yeah, 3 slides just to kind of tell some stories about people I've encountered that have especially rich stories. This is Kurt Bench and his wife Karina, who farm outside of Toledo, Ohio. And Kurt's grandfather used to raise the best, sweetest sweet corn in the Toledo market for 30, 40 years. And Kurt grew up on the farm working with his grandfather, decided he didn't want to farm, he wanted a more lucrative career. He went to college, got a job with Archer Daniels Midland trading grain. And after getting that job and starting to buy his land, which was right next to his grandfather's, he had this realization that what he wanted to do with his life was to bring his grandfather's sweet corn back. So he works full-time at ADM so he can hire 21 people part-time to manage his farm. And I think this is a kind of good symbol of where we are with this food movement. A lot of us have one foot planted in something that pays the bills and maybe isn't everything we want it to be, but it does help us get money and helps us make other plans. And another foot in something that's really fluid, changeable, unpredictable, but seems like the way we want to go. And I think he's a great example of that, because he could sit back in his porch at 4:30 every afternoon and watch the wind blow over the cornfields, and he could relax at 4:30. But he comes home and starts farming, and it really goes to considerable stress. He's now up to about 400 CSA members selling vegetables directly to his neighbors. He does the sweet corn at the farmers markets every Saturday. And he's really taking some immense leaps to try to make something different happen. And I think that's what characterizes this food movement we're in, is that people just break the barriers and open up the envelope to some new possibilities. Matt and Jerica Cadman are farmers in East Texas. I interviewed them about 4 years ago. Matt told me a story about being a student when he was in college. And he got very seriously, like almost fatally ill. He said, the only thing that cured me was eating the best food possible. So he went to some classes, completely changed his diet, went to much more farm-based primal foods than he had been eating before. He said he had $70,000 of medical bills to pay out of his own pocket, in addition to whatever insurance might have covered. Well, he and his wife were engineering students, were sort of shrewd, and they started finding the farmers who were raising the really good beef, the good grass-fed beef, and the folks who had raw milk, and the folks who had the stuff they wanted to eat. And at one point, they said they got to where they were going to 22 farms a month to buy the food that they wanted to have so they could be healthy. And they sat down and said, it'd be easier to farm than to do this. And so at that moment, Matt's father magically appeared and said, I'm looking for a place to live in the country. You want to go together on that? And so they had a phone conversation, and the father decided to help finance buying a farm. And he could put up a house nearby. They could live close to each other, have time with the kids, and Matt and Jerica could start to farm. When I met them, they were talking about how to work with inner city kids in Shreveport, showing inner city folks with less income how they could eat some of the more basic foods that are available at low cost from their farm, and cooking better food, and hopefully getting out of some of the food-related diseases we have in the U.S. So again, just taking a very amazing leap forward in something that was, they both dropped engineering degree programs to do this. We've lost one of the cameras, if that means they've signed off or something.
It's reconnecting.
Then Newt Lynn inherited a plantation in Louisiana, not far from Shreveport. And as you might be able to see from the combine, he's got enough acreage. He probably has 7,000 acres. It's really a large plantation. And he's raising rice and cotton pretty reliably. But the story he told me was, he said, I started looking at the commodity markets, and I got really nervous because they're really unstable. The price isn't reliable. I'm not sure I'm going to get the price I need for the food I want to grow. So he started diversifying by raising vegetables. And in this bin back here are watermelons he's raising now. He sells those to a broker who comes by his farm and picks up cases of those and ships them to the local grocery stores. But again, he has wealth, he has land, he has equipment to do rice and cotton at a large scale, but he wanted to do something else that would help diversify his income stream by getting food to the people who live near him. All three examples of people are kind of straddling these two worlds and trying to make whatever is possible happen out of this uncertainty we're wrestling with. So I wanted to just say quickly, too, that my vision of a food system is that it really should build health, wealth, connection, and capacity in our communities. And I think what's exciting about the green movement now is people are sort of reclaiming, well, I want to know the farm where my wheat was raised, or my kamut, or whatever, and I want to have special recipes that really speak to the season I'm in, or to the bacteria in my climate, or the flavors I want to have in my meal. And it's really a system of kind of making choices where we say we're going to build the food system we want rather than enduring the food system we've got. And I think that really it's important, I think, to take that step of saying we can make choices again. And my suggestion would be we think about, does our food system build health? It did not for Matt and Jerica Cadman. They took great steps to kind of get out of that conventional system into something that they thought would be healthier. Does it build wealth, especially for farmers? Well, it does sometimes, not very reliably other times. Maybe if it's reliable now, we're not sure what's going to happen in the future, so we're looking for new options. But also the idea of connecting around food. When I have my family over for a holiday, I will often serve the foods that my mother served to me when I was young, which are the same foods that her grandmother served off a wood stove in Michigan, which are the same foods that her grandmother served off of a wood stove in the old world. And what I'm doing is I'm really passing on a tradition where I say, this is what was easy to grow where my people came from. This is our place on the planet. It's the foods that they could do. I was telling a story about rye bread today over dinner. Rye was very, very favorite in this area, so we had a lot of great rye bread, and I have that recipe passed down. But having my great-grandmother's rye bread recipe makes a difference to me. And there's a reason that we kind of often eat together when we have meetings. We build a culture around food that really nothing else does. And I think that I'm appalled at the number of food policy conversations I'm part of where culture and the need to connect never really comes to play. But finally, though, we also need to think about having the capacity to really handle food well. Probably 100 years ago, if we'd had a meeting in this, maybe you were at meetings in this, or your ancestors were at meetings in this parish here, but probably everybody in the room was a farmer who really knew how to raise grain or knew how to take pork from a pig to meat if need be. And now we have food with very fancy packaging and bells and whistles, but we often are dumber as a society about food than we were 100 years ago. And the one story I tell is that I gave a speech in Alabama, and a woman started up and ran out of the room as soon as I was done talking. And I thought it said something really offensive to her, but she came up to me later that night when I was doing a public event, and she said, I had to leave because I had to go home and call my mom, because I told her, Ma, I got to learn how to cook. A 45-year-old professional woman, worked as a planner, she had never learned how to cook. We also have low-income people, and you probably are very familiar with this, where at least maybe not here, but in the States, where people didn't buy pots or pans for their kitchen because to them eating is opening up something for the microwave or going out to a restaurant. And I think those are tragic things, because if we're not building those skills into the culture, if kids don't grow up learning how food is raised, they can't really eat well. If they don't know how to share those foods, they really can't build a strong sense of connection with each other. So in my view, this is a pretty nice, simple way to think about a complex issue, which is what all should be accomplished when we build food systems. I'm going to skip over the next just to save a little time here. To me, the goal of what we do is to build what I call a community-based food system. Some people refer to this as local food. I really have I don't want to say the number of miles food travels is my important measure of success. And I think it's really important to build community as you do this. And we'll have some examples of how that's happening. My definition of that is systems of exchange that build affinity between producers and consumers. And of course, I add on my my purpose statement to say to build health, wealth, connection, and capacity. The folks who are doing that are building longevity and sustainability into their system. Here's an example of the difference between local food and community food. These are oranges that were raised on a farm 12 miles outside of Tucson, Arizona. And they're being sold at the food cooperative grocery store in Tucson, Arizona, 12 miles from the farm. Unfortunately, there's a state law in Arizona that forces retailers to sell oranges that have been processed. I think it's a cold water wash to take fungus off the plants to make sure they'll have more safe shelf life. So these oranges to be sold at the co-op had to go to Los Angeles for processing, because the only processor of scale to do it that cheaply is, I don't know, 6 hours away? I don't know, a long ways away. And then they had to come back from Los Angeles to the store where they're sold. That's local food, it's not community-based food. And the more we can bring those processes into our communities and add value ourselves and have those connections between ones we make by trading together, the better off we are, I think. Very quickly, this is sort of my model of a food system. It's a circle where we have farmers on the top, or fisher people, or whatever. And basically the food, the nutrients travel to, clockwise through this, through aggregators, distributors, processors of various kinds, ending up in consumer households, and then at the very end, organic waste from the food sector going into recycling to become new fertility for farms. It's a very cyclical process. And also, to make that work, we need policymakers, researchers, we need clean air, clean water, good soil, good healthy soil. If those things don't work in a balance, the system really gets very vulnerable. And a lot of people I know have a much more simplified view of a food system, but they end up coming up with more simple answers that are really useful. But the other thing I'd say is that people also connect across these categories all the time. So in fact, what we have is a very complex network of connections where people are talking to each other across these boxes on an hourly basis. And if we don't understand those conversations and that complexity, it's very hard to move forward. So food systems are networks, and in some ways it's no more complicated than that. It's no matter what kind of system you do. So let me start with a very simple answer, or a simple example of a grain mill I met in Virginia. The Moving Meadows Farm is a farm that's adopted intensive grazing practices. They put cattle on a field for 2 or 3 days, move them off to a new fresh bought of grass, let that grass recover, move them to another paddock, and they keep rotating them around and grazing very intensively because they get better quality grass, better fresher nutrients, and grass also grows faster when it's harvested by the animals. So he's got this whole system down. He's doing very, very high quality beef. Well, he wanted to open up a store where you could buy in town where you could buy his beef. And he and his wife sat down and said, how do we afford a store? Because we're not selling enough beef to make that happen. So his wife is a baker, said, well, let's do bread too. So they installed a mill. They have a bakery, and she grinds flour fresh. She bakes that into bread. They sell bread, they sell their frozen meats, and they also sell some gifts and other value, from processed food items at the store. Here the owners just said, we want to do a business that fits our lifestyle, fits the things we like to do in our day by day, but also will provide a service to our customers. This is Wally Hudson, who is the owner of the farm. This is their grain mill, and people can bring in a 50-pound bag of flour and have it milled to order if they want to, or they can have it milled fresh and made into bread right away. So they're essentially giving customers new options that they didn't have before this store got there. And then they have a nice display showing other milled products. That's very small scale, very informal. Nothing wrong with that model if that's where you're starting. Then this is Shepherd's Grain, which is really now a pretty mammoth operation. It's based in Washington State and Oregon. I visited when I was doing a study for the city of Spokane, Washington, where this farm was about 15 miles away, and they said, you got to talk to Fred out at Shepherd's Grain. And Fred Field, who's one of the 2 founders of the business, basically told me, I did this because it was the only way to protect this land that my family's been on for several generations. I knew if I kept farming the way my father had farmed, I wouldn't be able to own this land because there wouldn't be enough return. So we had to think very carefully about what to do. This is not his farm, but it's a picture of the countryside there. Homestead in 1888, started with 160 acres, moved up to 1,100 acres, run by 3 families. And he had this great quote. He said, in the 1980s, working in agriculture was like to make a subsistence living. We were totally dependent on government subsidies for our income, and they decided they wanted to break that cycle by adding more value to the grain. In 1985, he added a seed company, so he'd have he could sell seed as well as selling the final product. And then in the 2000s, as things didn't get that much better, in 1999 we had kind of another crisis in agricultural economics in the States. He decided to diversify, and he said, I have to get bigger or I'm not going to have enough money, so he added more land to the farm, took on new debt, and he also started milling the wheat he was raising into flour. He found a business partner named Carl Coopers, and they wrestled a lot with how do they diversify, how do they add some value and expand. And they finally decided what we really do well is grow wheat, so let's grow wheat. Let's grow more of it. Let's recruit our neighbors to grow for us, and we'll then mill that down into flour, and we'll find people who want to buy it. And also, by having a differentiated product, they could say to shoppers, you can pay a little bit more for this because it's something we milled fresh for you, it's locally raised, and they had a way of making it distinguished from the flour that's available at the store. At the time, though, no mills were available. They didn't have you in the community. There was no place to mill that flour. So in the course of looking for places to market his grain, he ran into an Archer Daniels mill in Archer Daniels Midland Mill in Spokane. And he started chatting with the mill owner, and he said, we don't do local grain, but he said, we could. And they had a conversation about that, and they decided to work together where Shepherd's Grain would raise the wheat and ADM would mill that into flour for local markets. It was a business step that they had not anticipated taking until they talked to each other. And luckily, the mill owner had enough independence to make a decision independent of his corporate body to say, we're going to go in this direction to diversify our income stream. So it helped diversify both the farm and the mill at the same time. At this point, ADM has the first right of any grain that's grown by Shepherd's Grain Farms to mill that into flour for them. So it's really become a very lasting partnership. What Fred said was when he had this expansion plan, his instinct was to find new farmers, but then he said, no, I have to sell the grain before I can recruit farmers to grow it. So we went around and just did some marketing, finding people who would say, yes, I'd like to buy some local grain. When he lined up enough buyers that he thought he could have enough flow of deals, he then started talking to his neighbors and say, if you'll grow grain for me, he had a protocol for what he considered a healthy way of raising grain. He said, if you follow my protocol, I will buy your grain and I can sell it to this way for this price. So they had that whole organic process of finding buyers and also finding neighbors who would grow more acreage. They also had some help from Washington State University that did some research on, first of all, what was the actual cost of raising grain, so they could have a really good definition of what did they need for a price. So they went through farmer records and said it's going to cost us this much per acre to raise the grain. That means if we go below that price, we're not going to make money. They gave them some tools for planning, and they also researched some to verify the quality of the seeds that they were using, so they could really say this has a good protein content, it has the right moisture content, and the attributes that the market wants. So they got help from technical experts. But again, just by sort of starting like you started and then asking around and saying, where do I want to go and who's going to be a partner if I do that? In Fred's case, he said no one ever came up with a strategic plan. We just started doing things, and when it worked, we kept doing it. And I don't necessarily recommend that way, but it can be a very nice, if you will, organic process for just saying, When you find a partnership, you ride with that for a while. If it makes sense to you, you keep going with it. If it doesn't make sense, you try something else. And that can be a very valid strategy, but you also have to have enough money to make some mistakes doing that. And some people would prefer to have a real strategic plan where you say, we think it's going to cost this much, and we have that spelled out. And that's an equally valid way to go, but you also have to have the resources to make that happen. They're now selling 600,000 bushels of grain a year. And this is 4 years ago, so it's probably much more than that by now, but they've grown into a whole network of, I think it's 52 growers altogether.
What was your time frame from 2000 to 600?
That would be starting in 2000. They started the planning, had grain in the field by 2002, 2003.
Right.
And then by 2014, they had 600,000 bushels.
Impressive.
Yeah. He says what he's selling is the fact it's farmer-led, it's a collaborative arrangement, it's not a formal co-op, it's just that we're collaborating together, but farmers are in charge, we have set the rules, no one else is telling us what to do, and we have that authentic product that no one else can offer, and we are covering the whole Pacific Northwest. So they have a long list of stores in Seattle, Portland, Oregon, Spokane, Boise, that you can find their flour.
And if they already had the mill who would mill it for them, what was their motivation to go out and find a bunch of other farmers?
I think just probably to sort of be the first ones in the market, so they had a unique product that no one else would be able to corner their sales. It's basically say, like, if we do this and it shows well, someone with more money might come in and do it and compete with us. So let's really flood this market as much as we can with as much grain as we can produce, and then slowly build up greater visibility. The other thing I think it's interesting is when I interviewed him in 2014, he said, we've gotten so big now, we kind of are turning over the business over, hiring a CEO, because we have enough deal flow that we want to hire someone to manage it and be a little more competitive in the marketplace and have more savvy about marketing. I haven't talked to him since that happened. I called them and asked them if they would share some information about suppliers, and the guy didn't return my call, so I can't tell you it's working well or badly. But they got to a point where they just said, the founders, who are in their high 70s, just said someone younger has to take this on, and really someone who knows marketing. We're farmers, we're not marketers, so let's find someone who really knows that well. They're actually pretty good marketers too, but and I think the real core here is, I think, which is the story about all these stories, really. It's a huge miracle that we're here where we are, he said. And he's humble in a way that's very, very nice. I mean, he did a lot of hard work. It's not totally an accident, but he's gracious about saying this is because of a lot of collaborations. And I think what struck up me was he said the secret to this was investing in relationships. Basically saying we're going to find someone who we want to work with, we're going to get to know them, we're going to treat them well, and those relationships, those connections will help us find new opportunities, find wider reach, and if we build a lasting set of relationships, we'll get out of this commodity system that's sort of trying to squeeze us out. And he also mentioned it's a mutual sense of relationship. It's not just I'm reaching out to someone, but we're building trust both ways. And your relationship to me is as important to me as my relationship to you. So, one of the central restaurants or core partners that I visited was a restaurant called Central Kitchen in Spokane. And they feature bread that they make fresh in the restaurant every day using shepherd's grain flour. Every time I go there, I buy a loaf of bread to take home with me because it's really phenomenal bread. Well, what they did was they had the kitchen staff, the owner, the chef, and the owner are the same person. Their baker and their sous chef all took the staff out to the farm one day, and they drove the combines. They learned how they plant the wheat. They had a chance to really find out where the wheat comes from, so when people order the bread, they can tell the story of visiting the farm, and they can say, yes, I was out at Fred's farm, and this is what we saw. And that extends the authenticity, extends the sense that you're relating the customer right to the farm, so they know where the grain came from. And that lasting connection really helps fuel this over time. Okay, that's the Pacific Northwest story. Very very large-scale effort at this time. I think I have some another bigger grain mill story later, but now I'm going to talk about the folks that I met at the MOSES is the acronym for Midwest Organic and Sustainable Education Society. It's the largest organic growers conference in the country. 3,700 people gathered in La Crosse, Wisconsin about a month ago. And they have great programs on how do you do grass-fed beef, how do you do grain, how do you check for GMOs in your product. They really have a wealth of great educational material. And I went to their grain program. So I met a guy named Tor Oxner. Has anybody run across his name at all? Okay.
Pretty fond of him.
Huh?
Pretty fond of him.
Yeah, I liked him a lot, yeah. Have you seen this book by any chance?
Yeah.
Okay, so this has a good little description of Tor and how he's built his business, and I haven't read that much of the book yet, but this is one way to learn about Tor and his work. And he was in upstate New York in Newfield, and he's a farmer who was raising wheat and other heritage grains. He was looking for a better market, looking for a way to add value. And so he, over time, by growing the grain, he found someone who wanted to bake that into bread. And he found someone who would help him set up a mill. And the interesting story that I'm surprised, which I learned from the book, is that he wanted to do milling. He didn't have he couldn't afford a new building, so they bought an Amish-built barn and repurposed it into a grain mill. So they got it much cheaply. And this guy comes along and says, "I repurpose buildings. Can I help you?" And so again, this organic process where no one could have predicted that this would happen at the beginning, but by taking steps forward, people surfaced to help support the vision. So he has a bread CSA where people buy up front to get a certain number of loaves of bread on a weekly basis from his bakery. He's milling his own grain, which he can sell as milled flour. He goes to the New York City green markets where they require the people who are selling grain to sell locally raised grain. And that decision by the green market increased the market opportunities for the farmers in upstate New York because they are required to tell which farm it came from and sell the local product. And so he has a cluster of businesses. He's essentially started from his farm just because by adding value, he had to have a more complex business that where he could diversify from just being a farmer to other forms of business. Harold Wilson also spoke, and he's got a farm called Janie's Farm in central Illinois. And then he told a story about how he diversified his farm. And he's also got a mill on his farm, very much like you seem to have. And he's raising high quality grains. He's buying grain from his neighbors. He's milling that into flour. And he's now trying to get that into. He's got it in the Chicago markets and trying to get it into Detroit. And then third is John Whirling from Meadowlark Farm in Ridgway, Wisconsin. And he has a group of 6 or 8 farmers who formed a cooperative to grow grain together and to mill it together. And they have Meadowlark Organics, which is that co-op. And then I love this name, the Lonesome Stone Mill. And they bought a mill, I think, from North Carolina and started grinding grain for themselves. So a really quick review of these. Tor started as an auto mechanic for an Audi repair service, Audi at VW. But his family background was in farming, and I think at some point you said, I want to explore this history I had being young on the farm, and I want to do something that expresses that. And he said, because our soil is stony, we emphasize small grains because we could grow them there. Freshly milled heritage grains. He did not form a co-op. He runs these businesses himself. He owns them privately, but he says, I really believe I show everybody my price points. I basically make sure we are negotiating fairly with our prices. I want to make sure the whole system is clear to everybody. And he just says, again, it's about relationships. That he's transparent because he wants to really be honest with the people who work with him, and he wants them to feel good and trust him over time.
That comment under grower about stony soil and small grains, what small grains would he be referring to?
Well, I see in the Midwest, actually I shouldn't say this Midwest, but the term is often that if you're raising corn, you're raising grain, and if you're raising soybeans, you're raising an oil crop, and small grains are sort of the assortment of other grains that are not as big in the commodity stream, but it could be spelt, it could be heritage varieties of wheat. You know, it could be kamut, it could be any kind of stuff. It's sort of a catch-all term that's a little bit vague and not totally accurate, but it would be, you could say it's growing grains for a niche market rather than for a global commodity trade. Yeah. And I think that's the meaning of the word small that makes the most sense to me.
You could compare it to cereal. Small and cereal would be.
Yeah. I mean, I think you could argue that wheat's a big grain. You could also argue that wheat is a small grain. So I think that line is a little bit fuzzy in my mind. Here are all the crops that he grows on his farm. And he does this both to have different products. I'm sorry this is so small, but I'll read them too. Corn, 3 varieties of wheat, a soft winter wheat, a hard red wheat, and a hard red spring wheat. Rye, buckwheat, red clover, mixed hay, soybeans, kernza, triticale, Japanese millet, annual ryegrass, forage turnip, forage rape, and winter pea. And he's raising a lot of those as cover crops to help fertilize the soil, to help build nutrients, to help balance the soil, to build organic matter in the soil. And he has an elaborate rotation where he basically rotates those crops through the fields, and then he grows grain when the field is ready. So he has the best quality grain possible. To go to Harold Wilson in Illinois with Janie's farm, he had a neighbor who inherited some land that had been farmed well, but conventionally. And this neighbor went on a national search looking for someone who could take that land over and farm it organically. They said, we'll lease you the land if you will farm it organically. And they looked all over the country, didn't find anybody who wanted to locate there. And then Harold heard about this and said, well, I'd like to convert to organic. I'll take over your farm. So he's leasing this neighbor's land. And their daughter, one of the siblings that owned the land is now running the mill for him. So 2 neighbors who had complementary resources just said, let's work together. Let's not fight each other. And his neighbor also buys hay from him to feed their cattle. So they have this very nicely integrated cluster of businesses. And he spoke quite a bit about how he writes leases with the farmers who grow for him. He says, I have a fixed rate of rent, which is pretty low, and then we share 1/3, 2/3 the crop. So when I sell the product, I will give 1/3 of the money I earn to the farmer who raised it, and I keep the rest for my work in milling it. But that's in addition to the flat rate for the per acre charge. So he said over many years of trying that, he found that to be the most equitable solution because it helps insulate everybody from the risk of hail disaster or climate disaster, and also people felt like they were being taken care of in a good way, where the more you produced, you made more, but also you had some kind of basic per acre buffer too. He mills, he has his own mill, he mills it into flour, and he's selling it where he can. And then John Whirling in Wisconsin basically started cleaning and dehulling grain, and then found out that there was a bigger market than they anticipated. Started saying to the neighboring farmers, we can take your grain and dehull it and get it ready for market for you. And he said basically there were so many farmers who wanted to grow grain for him, he couldn't sell it all. So he basically just sort of had to tell people, slow down, we're going to build this markets as quickly as we can. And he said one of the dilemmas he found is that a lot of the buyers say they want a farmer-to-farmer connection. They want to know the farm where it was raised, but they don't really want to have to take the time to go out and meet the farmer. So they talk a lot about that. The authenticity is part of the story they want to buy, but they don't necessarily follow through with that. So that's a kind of warning from him about the marketing side of it as well. And then this is he has a 6-year rotation. These are the crops that he grows. Alfalfa first, which builds the soil nitrogen for a winter grain crop. When he harvests that winter grain, he does, and that can be wheat, rye, or spelt. Then he goes to corn, soybeans, or some other dry bean, then a spring grain, and then back to alfalfa. So he's building up the soil in 2 of those cycles so he can get high production, well, 3 of those soil cycles actually, to get higher production in the other 3. Okay. And then there's a whole network in New England, and I don't know if you've made contact with them, and I haven't really talked to them directly, but I've heard for years, I've been at conferences where people said we have small growers raising grains, heritage grains or whatever, and we just started having conferences, an annual meeting, we network together and we find out where the market's taking us. I have a feeling that King Arthur Flour might buy wheat from some of them, but I don't know that for sure. But their network is really much more led by the growers themselves saying, we're small and we need to kind of talk to each other to learn how to do this together. So they have an annual conference and they compare notes and they have speakers come in and they really build a system. So that's a much more decentralized approach than either TOR used or these other three speakers, where it's really not about me owning a business, it's about us as small business people collaborating together. And then this is one of my favorite stories now, is Wolf Cooperative in Northeast Indiana. This is just a precious story. So an Amish man named Bontrager owned an organic grain mill in a small town of Indiana. And he's surrounded by Amish-owned poultry operations that are raising organic chickens and organic eggs. He's surrounded by Organic Valley dairies who are all buying organic grain from his mill. He bought the mill, I don't know, 6-7 years ago. He said after 3 years, he went to organic 6-7 years ago. He had owned it for about 15 years. He said, I realized the market was taking off more than I could possibly keep up with. So he went to 8 of his Amish neighbors, the sort of elders in his community. He said, I would like you to buy me out, and then we'll form a cooperative. And if you buy me out and we form this cooperative, then I will run it for 10 years. It's an amazing kind of generous thing of saying, I need capital, I need your support, I can't do this alone, but also I'll help you make it happen. Instead of saying, no, this is my business, I'm going to do it my way, which many people would do. But he had neighbors he could trust. Those relationships are sort of inherent in Amish culture. They didn't have to build them from scratch like we often do. And they formed a cooperative. I know some Amish who don't join co-ops because they consider co-ops to be an instrument of the state of Wisconsin, and they say we can't join that because it's not contrary to religion. And one of the elders in this community, when he heard that argument, said, well, how many of you are selling milk to the Organic Valley truck? Well, then you're co-op members. And that whole argument dissipated right away because they said they were already in cooperative business and they could take that step very naturally. So here's a diagram just showing what they have. This is the mill in the center of these 4 counties, and they have 80 farmer members, 40 non-farmer members selling grain to this co-op. They sell milk to Organic Valley. They sell feed to these operations to the northeast of them. And they went from $1.6 million of sales to $15 million of sales in 3 years. And he said that was despite, as soon as they made the transition, they had a fire, the entire mill burned down, they had to build it all from scratch. And they went through that crisis together. They put the loans in order, they got the mill back up and running, and they're in a situation where there's so much demand about them that it's growing at incredible speed. And this is now 3 years ago that I talked to them, so I really can't tell you how much they're selling today, but tremendous growth. And it's also a sign of this kind of rising awareness in consumers saying we want organic products, and that comes back to help mill. This is organic corn. These are not small grains, but it's an organic industry that is really thriving in that part of the country. And there's their elevator, the brand new one after the fire. The next one is not a grain story, but it's a really clever example of a group of growers getting together and really figuring out how to cut through the problem of whether a buyer will be loyal to you or not. And I had a small role in this because I did a study for this region in 2009, and out of that study, people decided they wanted to create a regional destination for organic food in their region, and the whole story kind of grew from there. This is a region that has sandy soil, a lot of hills, a lot of rocks. It wasn't suited for mechanization, so you didn't have the large grain farms come in. A lot of the small farms are located there, a lot of Amish and Mennonite farms in the area as well. And a group of people my age went out there in the early 1970s to start raising food organically because land was cheap, and there was no competing buyer because everybody wanted to buy flat land for big machinery. And they grew organic vegetables for 30 years with almost no reward. They really had small markets, small income, just kept going because they thought it was the right thing to do, and they put their hats on that direction. Some of those farmers now have six-figure income selling organic produce. And after getting to where they had established a mature business, making contact with grocers in the Twin Cities, Chicago, Madison, they said, we want to be able to sell even more product because we now know how to farm, we know how to scale up. But we're really nervous because if we just sell to a grocery chain, we've seen the pattern happen where they buy from us for 6 months and then they say, oh, we're going to give you $1 a pound less. And suddenly something that seemed like a lucrative contract becomes an albatross around your neck. And so they said, we need to form a system that's more stable than simply throwing grain on the market and seeing what the price is. We want to get out of being price takers and really help shape the price ourselves. Luckily, they're in a town that has a very strong cooperative tradition. And through the local economic developer, they courted the hospital, Gunderson Lutheran Hospital, which is a private hospital that could spend a little bit more money on food. And they said, how'd you like to buy food from us? And the CEO said, sure. And then they said, how'd you like to join our co-op board? So they formed a multi-stakeholder co-op where the hospital CEO was on the board with a group of growers and the workers who work in the factory. And then, as they thought about this, said, distribution costs are going to kill us. We can't afford our own trucks. We don't know that system. And the hospital CEO says, well, my squash partner owns Reinhardt Foods, which is a national distribution system. And in Broca, Wisconsin, he was willing to join a co-op board to make a cooperative happen. So every year now in November, the hospital that's buying, the distributor, and the growers sit down and say, how much food does the hospital and our other consumers want to buy? Who's going to bid to grow that food? And they set a minimum price and they set a maximum price. And they've all agreed that they're not going to violate those limits. And they say the prices are set so that no one will go broke and no one will make a killing. But if you uphold the system, it means everybody has every reason to uphold a rational pricing system for produce in that area. This is by no means no one's getting wealthy in this co-op. It still has some things to iron out, but it's an incredible example of saying, let's bring the buyers into a system, a community-based food system, if you will, where basically say we're developing loyalty instead of trying to squeeze the price out of each other. And I don't know of a single project in the States that's more advanced in its vision than this. So I think it's a good thing to kind of hold in your mind. This is the factory this is another story that happened. I gave my speech 2 months later. This factory shut down overnight. Nothing I said, but it was a printing factory. A national company owned it, and they just decided to consolidate their operations in another state where labor was cheaper. And the head of the Economic Development Association called the CEO on the phone. I think I have a picture here. Here's the loading docks. Here's Sue Noble, head of Vernon County Economic Development Association. She called the guy up and said, we've supported your business for 15 years. You have 85 of the best jobs in town. What are you going to do to pay us back for this? And he didn't want to have the conversation. He talked around her for 20 minutes. And finally, he got worn down. He said, what do you want? And she said, sell us the building. And he did. For $1, they got a 100,000 square foot building, which needed a lot of work, but it was an amazing facility to have. They got some grant money from the U.S. government to take asbestos out, open up some new skylights, improve the water and electricity. This is the space they have now. In 9 years now, they've replaced all 85 jobs that were lost with jobs in the organic industry. And here's some of the organic squash that's going through the co-op. This is the co-op grocery store in a town of 4,000 that's designed in a Frank Lloyd Wright style. This is a community that has quite a bit of self-awareness. And I think I've really told this part of the story already, but that's again, a really powerful vision for how you do this in a more collaborative way. And it does take a special community. I don't know many communities in the country that could cooperate in this level, but 40 years ago they couldn't do it either. And by just starting the path and making the connections and starting to do business a different way, it became a real possibility in 2009. I think I've got one more example, then I'll stop talking at you. And again, this is not strictly about grain, but it's the same region that the Wolf Cooperative is in, so I wanted to kind of tie up that story a little bit too. I got hired by 11 County Economic Development Association to do a plan for what they call the Northeast Indiana Local Food Network. And the story here was very interesting because they said, as economic developers, they said, we have really strong agriculture and we have really strong food manufacturing, but they're separate businesses. We should get them talking with each other so the manufacturers can work with local farmers and do special products that are really unique to our region. After the farmers said, great. The manufacturers, after 2.5 years, said, we don't really want to collaborate with our competitors. We're all selling it in New York City. We don't have any reason to talk to other manufacturers down the road. We just don't want to do it. So after investing 2.5 years in that discussion, they finally backed off and said, we have to rethink this. At that point, they came to a firm that hired me to do some research for them. And we said, what do you mean by local food network? It turned out there were 5 different definitions in the room about what they meant by local food network. For some people, it meant, we've got a pig farmer down the road, and he's a really exemplary farmer, and he's selling pigs to China. And that, to them, meant an exemplary local farm, but it didn't mean a local food network, in my view. And they had other definitions were like, well, this farm has got 400 acres of broccoli, so he's a local food producer, but he was shipping that to Long Island. And so a process of winnowing that out, here's the counties, if you want to see that geographically. And the Wolf Co-op we talked about is up here. I don't need to. So we finally got them to decide on one definition, which was that local food networks for them meant the commercial, social, and cultural connections that sustain food trade in Northeast Indiana. A very progressive step for economic developers to take. But they realized that if they didn't hang their hat on that definition, their plans would not get them where they wanted to go. And mostly by sort of saying, which of these 5 do you want to choose? You know, it was just sort of reflecting back to them the different ways they were thinking about local food and saying, choose one and use it well, and whatever you do with that will lead you to a better place. As part of that research, I went to a farm called Seven Sons Farm, and Seven Sons had been a dairy farm in the past, and the couple that owned it sat down when they were about to retire, and they had, of course, as you might have guessed, 7 sons, and they said, we've had a good livelihood, but our sons can't take over this farm. The prices will not be high enough. If you know the milk prices are terrible, we can't produce enough milk to sustain all those 7 kids, and they seem to want to be on the farm. We're going to either have to sell the land and give them the money or reconfigure the farm in a drastic way. And they decided to reconfigure the farm so that each of their sons would have a business of their own. So one is the beef guy, one is the pork guy, one is the chicken guy, one is the egg guy, one is the business manager, one writes the software for all this to work. And they do, again, rotational intensive grazing where they run beef in the pasture, then they have the chickens come in and clean up some of the pests from the beef, then they have the pork come in and add manure to the field, they then raise grass and graze very rapidly. And so by building up their soil, by building up their herd, they say they're getting $4,300 profit per acre by raising livestock. And they're supporting 7 families, which means 7 sons plus their spouses plus the houses and the farms that they have bought. So it's really a pretty monumental shift. And when I talked to Blaine Hitzfield, who's sort of the business manager guy of one of the sons, I said, you know, I'd like to try to show to the economic developers the strength of your business. Who do you sell your meat to? And he said, well, we have 5,200 people on our email list. We send out word when we have meat available, and people order it. We designed our own ordering platform with our own software writer, so they can order that. They have some special bells and whistles that makes that easy for the consumers. And then we take the orders on Wednesday, we fill up a truck and we drive to 45 drop sites around the area, and we deliver food to these drop sites where people come and pick it up. I said, would you share with me the addresses of your drop sites? He said, I'd love to. No problem, I got it in 30 seconds. So I was able to do this map, which showed the reach of their network. And here's their farm right outside of Fort Wayne. Here are the drop sites in Chicago, the drop sites in Indianapolis, and a few in Detroit. This is where they actually have the meat process. It's a long stretch because they want to go to a processor that really does well with their meats, and they had to go that distance to get it. And I showed this map to the economic developers. I said, while you were not getting any progress with the manufacturers, these folks built this network. And these developers who had not really thought of farmers as being businesses, they're businesses too. And they had this realization that they should reach out to the farmers in their region in a very richer way to bring them into their business discussion. But the map also showed something very interesting, which was that Fort Wayne, the area closest to the farm, wasn't getting that much of their meat. That it was mostly going to high-end consumers in big cities that had a lot of expendable income. And the economic developers took the next step of saying, we have to work with local food bank because we want to find ways to get food into inner city Fort Wayne. So this one map of just showing this network that they built really conveyed both the strength and some of the gaps of this work in 30 seconds. It was really quite dramatic. And I think that this is a great way to kind of measure our progress. One of the neighboring farms asked me to, gave me a list of their farms that supply their operation. And as soon as you saw the map, you sent it out to all the growers and say, see what we're doing? It really had a good cachet because it really communicated very quickly the strength of that network. Here's the chickens. 275 dozen eggs a day out of this farm, hand washed. This is the on-farm store. They pulled a cabin out of the ravine on the corner of one property. They brought it up and cleaned it up. And it's an honor system. You walk in, you pull stuff out of the freezer, you put money in a till, and you take it home with you. And they get also $250,000 worth of product out of this store. They have their own canned meats. And I like this bacon because the bacon was raised up in Northeast Indiana, far from their farm, processed by a processor in Indianapolis, and they bring it here and they supply that so they can say we're in solidarity with other people raising local foods for local markets. So it's, again, these dense layered connections that are really pretty exciting. And that's the overall network, where essentially there's a guy who's wealthy who runs a gourmet restaurant right there, and he buys from all these farms. So he gives them visibility with clients who, he charges a lot for a meal, but he gives them visibility to people who have a lot of money to spend, and he helps really build their network by buying their product and featuring them and bringing them into the restaurant to talk with their customers. So it's a remarkable set of people really working together. And again, this network formed outside the Economic Development Association, but now they're embracing it as part of the answer for their region and part of the core of their local food network. So that learning was very, I think, incredibly strong. A lot of this is happening by private people who have some money to do something that, Seven Sons couldn't have happened if the parents didn't have wealth and they didn't have land to work with. Not everybody can start a farm from scratch like that. But there also are times when public investment can play a role. And to my mind, the public investment that's really richest is when public units of government, municipalities invest in infrastructure that makes local trade more efficient. And if we do that, we tend to create a competitive advantage for ourselves trading food within our locale. I'm going to skip the rest of this. That's my contact information. If you can't read that, I've got cards. But let me stop talking and let's just see if anybody has anything they want to say or react to about that.
Just one question.
Yes.
Can you reiterate that definition with the groups you came in on local? I was impressed.
You mean the Local Food Network?
Local Food Network.
Yeah, sure, of course.
That definition, I think, is important.
Okay, good.
Because at the moment with local food, we alienate 99% of the farmers.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
There's like me and the guys at the farmers market. And that one doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
I like that one.
Good. I'll get up on the screen so you can enjoy it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm
I'm happy to have you say that.
It not just alienates them, but it gets them on the defensive.
Right, right.
Which doesn't help.
I like the fact that it includes the term cultural connections.
Yeah, yeah.
That's something I haven't often seen in these definitions of local.
You hear it all the time in tribal reservations. You hear about it all the time in ethnic communities, but I don't think we bring it into the mainstream discussion very often at all. And it's really at the core of this. Because, again, the reason I do rye bread sometimes is that my ancestors could grow rye.
That's your culture.
And that's why it carries on. If I didn't have that connection, I could eat Wonder Bread, But I think that really that's our ability as a people to sort of carry things on through generations. That's not about commerce, it's not about politics, it's about us building trust with each other and building a sense of belonging. And I appreciate what you're saying about that getting through and hopefully being a kind of a message that people can approach easily.
People are obsessed with the 100 kilometers or 90 kilometers, but that's so much more.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, for economic developers to embrace culture was a pretty big leap for them too. They had not been thinking along those lines.
Ken, you must have some vastness that happens between farms and where people are as well. Because I find here, like you were saying, George, about that, people wanted 100 kilometers or 90. It's like, yeah, but our farms are vastly disappearing and
Right.
land is being taken away and suburbs are being built. So now those people that wanted 100K, it's not going to happen because our farms are getting pushed further and further afield, or not at all.
That's very true, and I often tell the story. I have a chicken farm. I could buy produce from 90 miles from my house. I don't like their chickens, so I go to someone who's 200 miles away, and I don't go there myself, but through my co-op, I have a choice of a higher quality product. It's a further distance, but it's the practices I like. It's the meat that I think is best for me to eat, since I'm not raising chickens of my own. And so I'm making a choice. It's really not about mileage. It's about supporting a certain farm's practices and feeling a connection through my co-op. And that to me is, again, I can buy bananas from Ecuador that are fair trade certified bananas, and I have maybe a co-op there sold to my cooperative grocery, and I have more of a connection with them than I would have with this chicken barn down the road. So that's what I try to say with my consumer dollars. The other thing another kind of distortion of this I've seen is that I'm working in one region in the Midwest where a wealthy person is trying to help start a cluster of farms, and he basically got so wedded to his vision that he started forcing people out of a collaboration because he wanted to go a certain way. And after saying he wanted to form a cooperative and have people work together, he got more immersed in his vision than in building a network. And so that, even someone with all the best intentions and someone I really like on a lot of levels really screwed up because he really built fragmentation into his farm community by forcing his image instead of saying, let's figure out what will make the network the strongest.
Seeing the examples that you presented here, it made me think, it may be a bit strange, but I think there's a big parallel. There's a lot of people who live within the inner cities, large cities like Montreal, Toronto, etc., all of the states. In Montreal, you may be familiar with them. They're called Loofah Farms. They're Loofah Farms.
Loofah Farm, okay.
They're a business that started out relatively recently, maybe 10 years ago, with greenhouses on. They started with one greenhouse on top of the building in the downtown core, and they're now up to 3.5 acres worth of glass. Well, not this. I think they're glass and plastic greenhouses. But the point being is that what they've done is very similar to some of these networks that you presented. They now have 200 other farms who, most of which they claim were quite skeptical of them, so maybe seeing them at what is this, like a downtown food production system, it's hydroponic.
It's not real farms.
Exactly. Yeah. So what they've managed to do through the discussions, education, collaboration, they have now 200 farms that supply 10,000 basket CSA through their business. And it includes all of the things they don't sell, and I think even maybe some things they do, but they've brought in charcuterie, meat producers, bread, and all sorts of other products. And so their customers through their CSA have a very vast array of things that they can get on a weekly basis. And those farmers are already coming into the city regardless for other markets and whatnot, but it's given them a whole new market to collaborate with this greenhouse operation. And the customers who originally went to the greenhouse operation wanted something as local as possible.
Yes.
So that's why they wanted to buy from the greenhouses.
Right.
And it's blossomed into this very large network that I think is really impressive and interesting because it's a whole array of different ways of producing.
I would say that like the folks in Wisconsin where the co-op flourished, for 30 years they built networks. They built collaboration. They had the grocery co-op. They basically said we can't change the market, but we can work with each other. We can collaborate. They built a culture of collaboration, which wasn't there in 1969, and is foreign to some people who live there. But it also has supported these people to do business in a very creative way. And the networks you're describing in Montreal will also create a lot of future in 40 years too. And another quick story about collaboration. I was in a town of population 42 10 years ago giving a speech about their local food economy. We had a restaurant that was about the size of that stage, a little bit bigger, but really tiny place, really small town. And we all packed in there, and we had a projector and my PowerPoint, and I gave my speech. And at the end of the day, the owner of the restaurant said, "I'm looking for pork. I can't find good pork around." 3 people raised their hand. In a town of 42, she didn't even know who the pork growers were. And and again, I mean, this just speaks to why we have to talk to each other and why we have to build that sort of sense of connection, because there's no reason that shouldn't have been like a simple phone call for her. And it wasn't until we got together and had that discussion that those things became possible.
A number of the examples that you talked about, you referred to the term, you called them organic operations. The term organic is kind of a funny term sometimes.
Sometimes it is, yes.
Multiple definitions
Yeah.
in the same room. Do you believe that to go forward with this type of thing, to be successful, you have to be organic?
No, I don't believe you have to.
And actually, as a follow-on to that, I don't know what the difference is between Canada and the States in the definition of an organic.
Oh, I don't know the Canadian definition at all. I know that what I've seen happen is that the conference I went to in Wisconsin that had 3,700 people, when in my 20s, that was a conference of 600 people in a smaller town. And the folks there basically said, as organic growers, we have to define our standards for ourselves, or they'll be defined for us by someone else.
Yeah.
They wrote some very wonderful, very detailed, very accurate standards, and then they watched the political process grind those up into something that's much more serving corporate organic growers than anyone else. But by starting that direction, they at least made it less worse, because the standard had to kind of deal with the reality that someone had written good regulations that they could have followed.
Yeah.
And then, I know growers now who don't grow organic mostly because they think it's more paperwork they want to take on. They try to minimize chemicals, but they don't care about certification because their customers don't really care. They're buying from a farmer that they trust, and they don't care about the label organic. Most, like a hospital that's offering organic food, they have to have it certified because they're in a health facility. If they don't have certified product, they have legal problems.
Yeah.
And so, it plays a role in that of kind of assuring that certain minimum practices have been met. But it's really it's a production standard. It's not guaranteeing that the food is pure of chemicals either.
True. So in lieu of using the word organic, is there another word that you could suggest that doesn't have the legal terminology?
Well, there's all kinds of other terms. I mean, some people are using, some people say better than organic. And that, that's true, except you can't use the word organic on your label without this USDA seal in the States. They'll hang that sign at their farmers market for folks who aren't going to get them in trouble. Some people would say sustainably raised. Some people would say naturally raised. Those are also problematic terms because you don't know what they really mean. I think the best thing, for my mind, is to be transparent about your processes. So if you have a website, you say, "This is how I farm. These are the amendments I will use. This is what I won't use. This is my theory about why I do this." And then the consumer can make an informed choice and say, "This is a farm I do want to support or don't want to support." But I think, to me, that's a better thing than kind of worrying about the label. We're finding out some consumers are really weary of labels because they have like so many labels coming out. They don't trust any of them. They don't really know what to believe. And I think they will trust you and your presence as a person and as a farmer. And in a farmer's market setting or a CSA setting, your word as a farmer is what they're looking for more than a seal from US or the Canadian government. I also think it's good to have good standards. I don't think we have them, but we deserve better standards than we've got. But I'm glad to have some minimum standard that says this is organic, so that when I go to a store, I don't have to ask as many questions about which farm it came from.
Yeah, and I would also add to that, you know, generally speaking, the national standard, both in Canada and the US, is the minimum standard.
Yes.
And then you have all sorts of certification bodies who may go over and above, or may set a higher bar for
Right.
what protections.
And you have people who have fair labor standards, so we're saying this is not just good practices, but also we're treating our employees well and paying them well. You have other things that, you know, I mean, some people have a local label, so it says it came from our region, and that's really all you know. But if you know who the farm was, you can say, is that an organic farm or not? Some farms actually put a thing on, like a barcode that you can scan at the market, and it'll pop up a little website that shows what your practices are. So if anybody who really wants to ask those questions can get that answer before they make a purchase. Because I believe in this community-based food system, I think people should be treating trade out of a relationship, and they should say, I want a relationship with a farmer. And then they either do or do not trust that farmer and that connection. And you might have a consumer come in at you and ask you enough questions and you decide to change your practices because you want to keep them happy, or because they teach you something you didn't know before. Mm-hmm. Or you may push back and say, no, I'm not going to do that, and here's why. And they'll say, sure, I still want to buy from you. But that conversation is more important to me than the label.
Yeah, I can see that.
And I think for me, I really work hard to get people to know the specific farm the food came from, even if it's coming to a grocery store or a wholesaler, so that people can say, okay, I know that someone planted this and grew it, and I can trace that back. Yeah. But I mean, at some level, I mean, I'm a consumer, I'm at the store, I have a choice of 5 different labels. They're all abstract to me. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people don't trust the government enough to care if it's certified by the government. A lot of people say, I don't want to worry about the label, I just want to know that the product is good, and how do I find that out?
Great, thank you.
Well, we've done a lot of time here. Thank you very much for being here, and I can stick around for a little while until my ride leaves, if you want. If you have any more questions. But I'm really, really happy you all came. And I think maybe you should talk with each other about how you can build great businesses with each other too.
Can I get one more question?
Of course, sorry. Yeah.
We've had a few local co-ops that,
Yeah.
like, and organizations that have done very well and successful.
Yeah.
And then they get a big government grant.
Yeah.
And it destroys them.
Well, that happens to more than co-ops too. Yeah.
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 And like my main competitor is in Quebec, and we're buddies, and he gets about $200,000 a year in grants.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I get like maybe 1,000.
Yeah.
So like this whole grant thing is just.
Oh yeah.
And we have another organization about to flop just because of grants.
Oh boy.
And it's discouraging.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it must be worse in the States because the States are so small. And you know what I mean? There's so many of them.
Yeah, I mean, we have a fair amount of philanthropic money, which makes it actually Minneapolis is quite a difficult market because we have so many funders that all the nonprofits are fighting each other over the same pool of money, and so it's very dysfunctional in many respects because people are going after grants instead of getting the work done. But I also believe there's a role for people to do grants too. I mean, I think when you don't, I mean, if you weren't a Seven Sons sibling, you didn't have parents who could bequeath the farm to you or sell it to you at favorable terms, someone has to get you money or you're not going to go anywhere. And I think a lot of my work happens only because someone raises a grant and they hire me to do something where I can help shape a discussion for the better and help people collaborate better and maybe give them some financial information that helps them make shrewder decisions. And I think when you have money that's really building people's capacity and building people's connection, it's very valuable. when you have money that's just a cash flow, that means someone else tries to compete even faster, it's often a trouble sign. But I try to make everything I do be an investment in the future rather than simply a livelihood I make. And sometimes that doesn't work, but that's what I try to do. And I think, you have, Italy for a long time, and this is, I think, dismantled now, but they made it so that people with about 10 acres of soil could make a livelihood farming. And they did with major subsidies from the government, which basically said, we want to pay you to be on the land. And even though you're too small to compete with this market, we want to have you there, we want to keep the communities intact, we want the generations to pass on the farm, so we're going to give enough subsidy to make sure everybody of that size can stay farming. That's a pretty cool subsidy. They ran out of money to do it, and they ran out of some trade obligations that made it difficult to sustain. But that's really thinking about what's the value of the farm to the broader society, what's the public interest in having farmers. In Europe, a lot of European countries, they pay farmers to be in marginal lands so that people can come hike in a beautiful place and have a meal in a farmhouse. And so they really tie the subsidy to something that really serves a public purpose instead of just making someone have better income. And when those things happen, I think it's really a pretty brilliant use of money.
And in France as well, there's those payments are tied to extensive use of land.
Yeah.
As well as the cultural value of the beauty of farmland and all the ecological services that go along with that.
Right, right.
It's interesting that you said that in Italy that part of the reason for the loss of funding was because of unmet trade obligations.
Well, no. Just the more we've had the globalization of trade discussions,
Yeah.
Italy got told by trade negotiators, you can't do that because it's for so competitive reasons, saying you're helping small farms outcompete other farms elsewhere, and you can't keep doing that.
Yeah.
But that became a point of contention, and I haven't followed that discussion closely enough to know what changed it, but I think it was mostly that it was expensive, and so as the Italian economy got weaker, they just couldn't afford to keep doing it.
We're getting pressures on the milk now.
Forgive me?
We're getting pressures on the milk from
Yeah.
Mr. Trump.
Well, yeah.
So,
And
how bad is the dairy industry right now in the U.S.?
Oh,
I just heard the horror stories.
it's terrible. What we've had was there's an Organic Valley Cooperative, which is now $1 billion cooperative of co-ops with 1,600 farmers around the U.S. producing very high quality organic milk. And they built up a big war fund so they could sustain ups and downs in prices. And they built their business saying we're going to pay, I think it's $23 a hundredweight for milk, and we're going to keep a really high price. And they single-handedly raised the price of milk in the United States because it was such an easy choice to go organic and sell to them rather than stay with conventional. And the market for conventional milk really withered away, so the price went to nothing. And I think people are now raising conventional milk at below the cost of production. But Organic Valley and Horizon just announced they're going to cut back what they're going to buy. They're trying to make sure that the loss is dispersed around all their farms instead of forcing some farmers out. But they're going to pay less, and they're going to reduce the quota that they buy. But essentially, they have a quota system within the co-op. They basically say, this is how much milk we're going to buy from you, and because it's private, it's not subject to the same governmental interference, but it's a quota system that's done by people who agree to have a quota system instead of having a government-sponsored quota system. That doesn't make it more stable. It's as stable as long as the management has the right values and that people hold up their end of the deal. And I really prefer a national system of supply management, which would be institutionalized, but it's very hard to talk about in our political climate. It's hard to talk about anything in our political climate.